This is Winchester Academy.
Our speaker tonight, Linda Williams, comes to us from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She has worked for the department for 18 years, and she studied both her bachelor's and her master's degree. The bachelor's degree is in forestry and the master's degree in entomology from Michigan State University. So her job is identifying the issues that impact forest health. That would include insects, diseases, and abiotic issues such as drought and flooding. She has spent 17 years of the 18 in the Green Bay office, which covers 13 counties in northeastern Wisconsin, including Waupaca County. She recently transferred to Woodruff, but continues to cover Waupaca County because there is still a vacancy. So she is still the person to go to if we have questions. So I'd like to give a warm Waupaca welcome to Linda Williams.
All right, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay with the mic? Yeah, we're good? All right, excellent. Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to cover a few of the insect and disease and forest health highlights that we saw this past year, give you some ideas for things to watch for this year, and then I will have some time at the end for some question and answer because I know I'm not going to cover all of the insects and diseases that you guys want to hear about. So you'll be able to ask, if I don't happen to cover it, you'll be able to ask about it at the end as well. So let's get started. We do have several folks who are forest health specialists around the state. I'm now located up in Woodruff up here, and we did just have to redraw our boundaries recently in the last about 3 weeks ago, I think it was announced. We lost one position. We had 2 vacancies. Now we have just 1 vacancy. Unfortunately, that 1 vacancy is still right here in the middle, including Waupaca County. So I am still covering a number of these counties, as well as my home territory now. So, but for many years I did cover this area as part of my regular job. So we do have some other forest health staff that are located in Madison. In our headquarters. We do have a vacancy in our invasive plants coordinator position. We have a couple of LTEs that are working in the invasive plants, but our coordinator position is vacant. And I mentioned the 1 vacant field specialist position. So there's a few of us around the state, and depending on where you have land, will depend who you might be able to contact for some additional information on insect and disease issues. So I'm going to start out my presentation with this graphic. I start all of my presentations with this graphic. This is the Palmer Drought Severity Index graphic. And it goes back to about 1895 on the far left-hand side. And the current year is over here on the far right-hand side. Anything shown in green is a wet year. Anything shown in red is a dry, droughty year. And I've highlighted a few of the major drought points just so you can see what those were. So the last major drought that we had here was the 2012 drought. But you'll notice over here in our current year, we're peaking up here into the extremely moist category. Now, most people think that more water has to be good for plants. And if it's, depending on the plant that you've got, it may be, but trees are not always that way. There is a point where you can have too much water and the trees can actually start to decline in the exact same way that they would decline if they were in a severe drought. So when trees are in a severe drought, their roots start to die back. They have to die back some portions of their crown to match that dieback in the root system. And trees that are growing in saturated soils have to do exactly the same thing. So some of their roots die back, and then some of their crown dies back as well. So we are starting to see some impacts of that multiple years of extra moisture. Now, one of the things that this also promotes is fungal needle diseases and fungal leaf diseases. And one of the most common ones that you guys might be familiar with is the one that affects spruce, in particular blue spruce. It causes a thinning in the lower canopy, and as you move higher in the tree, the foliage looks better, it looks more full, but in the lower portions, it can be really thin. This is a needle disease, a fungal needle disease that needs a lot of moisture in the spring in order to attack and kill these needles. Multiple years of this can actually cause some lower branch dieback. There are some trees that are naturally resistant to Rhizospaera needlecast. They're genetically resistant, so they may very well be a blue spruce growing right next to a blue spruce, but one of them may look pretty good, and others, now granted this one's a little bit, it's not quite as nice a blue, but it looks pretty darn good compared to some of these. So there are some blue spruce that are naturally resistant to this needlecast disease, and our white spruce are mildly resistant as well. Norway spruce are quite resistant. So in order to control Rhizospaera needlecast, it's recommended to improve airflow beneath the tree. So again, as you move further up in the tree is going to look better because this portion of the tree up top is waving around in the breeze all the time, and those needles dry out a lot faster than the needles that are down here close to the ground. And the fungus needs that constant moisture, and eventually you'll start to get significant dieback in the branches. And if you've planted these blue spruce to be a view screen from the road or from your other neighbors, Rhizospaera needlecast will quickly change that for you. You won't have that view screen anymore. So this one is pretty significant in years when we have a lot of rainfall like we had this past year. I would expect a lot more of this year. Diplodia is another fungal needle disease that is a little bit more aggressive. It can actually kill branch tips. It's primarily a problem on red pine, but we have a lot of red pine down here. The mature red pine can handle, it kills a few branch tips, not a big deal. But if you have young red pine, particularly growing in the understory of a red pine plantation, spores are constantly raining down on these little red pine growing underneath. And the spores of Diplodia will infect the needles and infect the branches and kill that entire branch tip. So you can see this tree has multiple branch tips that are killed. This is what it looks like if you look a little closer. So we've got an entire branch tip here killed, and it just causes the tree to slow its overall growth. In addition, it can do enough damage that it simply kills the whole tree. If it kills all of the branch tips, it kills the whole tree. I have seen this occurring in some mature stands when we have at least 3 years of really wet weather. So if we have that occur, we need another year or so, then you might start to see some additional damage in our bigger mature trees. Once you've lost 50% of the branch tips on a big mature tree, the tree is probably going to continue to decline. But again, this one is pretty specific to red pine. I realize a lot of people have red pine though, so I definitely wanted to mention this one. What's that, I'm sorry?
Is it also called Norway?
Is it also, red pine? Yes, it is also called Norway pine, yes. Yes. So this is what I was seeing in some areas this past year from Diplodia. These are seedlings, red pine seedlings. You can see they're just simply totally dead. So I do expect to see more of that as well. Now the interesting thing about this situation, a lot of these red pine seedlings and saplings that are growing in the understory are not destined to be your next stand of trees. You're going to continue to grow that red pine in the overstory for another 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, and then you'll harvest it and you'll probably replant. So these trees are not really destined to be something important. It just bothers people when they die like this. So I get a lot of calls about it. One of the broadleaf problems that I get a lot of calls about is tar spot on maple. Tar spot is a fungal disease that causes these black blotches on the leaves. On our Norway maple, it causes very large blotches, at least the size of a quarter, sometimes larger. On our silver maple, it causes very small blotches, about the size of a pea. And so these occur pretty late in the season. People get very concerned. They think their tree is diseased. It sort of is. This only affects the leaves. This will not affect the growth of the twigs at all. This is a cosmetic problem, but it really bothers some people. So if it really bothers you, you can rake up the leaves once they fall and dispose of them. I would not recommend composting them if you're actually trying to reduce the inoculum level in your area, because composting will just keep that fungus alive in that nice moist environment. But again, this is a cosmetic problem, and if you just simply let the leaves drop and leave them there, that's okay too. It'll be back. It's something we see every single year, but it's not something that's going to affect the overall health of your tree. So getting back to the first slide that I showed, the second slide, about the Palmer Drought Severity Index with all the moisture that we had. We had a lot of spring storms in 2017, and they did drop a lot of rainfall, but they also did some other damage. We had a lot of storms that produced some wind damage, either straight line winds or tornadoes that would touch down and damage trees. So this picture that you see here is from this EF0 right up here in the corner of Oneida County. And it was just a small area, but it did a nice job of knocking out the trees. We had a lot of other smaller tornadoes popping up across the region, and we had some straight line wind events that just simply tipped the trees right over. So we did see this quite a bit this past year in many different areas all throughout the springtime. It seemed like it went on for every 2 weeks we'd have a new area of damage. We also saw hail associated with some of those storms. So we had lots of rainfall, we had lots of damaging winds, and we had hail in a lot of those. The hail was a problem for a couple of different reasons. Hail can break the branches, break the bark on the branches and allow fungal diseases to get into those branches. Hail can also strip off needles, leaves, and newly growing buds. And so it can do a significant amount of damage to the trees. The hail that occurred during the spring, unfortunately, did cause wounds on the branches. We also had wind breaking some branches. And this all happened during the high-risk time period for overland transmission of oak wilt, when the beetles can move oak wilt. Now, Waupaca County, I know, is kind of a hot spot for oak wilt. How many of you know you have oak wilt on your properties? Yeah, I hear chuckles, lots of hands, all right. So yeah, there's a lot of oak wilt down here. So you're thinking, yeah, so a few storms went through and there's a little more oak wilt. In some areas of the state, there's less oak wilt than there is here, and so it was a lot more noticeable. But we saw this around the state, that the storms did cause some damage that then allowed oak wilt to move in. So oak wilt is a fungal disease. It kills oak trees. The current name of the species of the fungus is Bretziella fagicearum. It was formerly known as Ceratocystis fagicearum. It just recently changed. For those of you that may have worked with pathologists in the past, they love to rename their fungi every 10 years, 20 years. So that's the newest name. And it's very effective at killing oak trees. It gets into the tree, it gums up the waterworks, it causes the leaves to start to wilt and drop off the tree, and the tree dies within a single growing season. This graphic shows the areas of the state where oak wilt is more common. Those are the counties shaded in red. The counties that are shaded in white, the counties that are not shaded, that have the little pink squares in them, those are counties where oak wilt is less common. Those small pink squares are 6 mile by 6 mile township squares where we have identified at least one location of oak wilt. So you can see in some counties, like Price for instance, there's not very much oak wilt. And in other counties, this year there was quite a bit more oak wilt found. For example, Vilas County suddenly had a bunch more oak wilt that was identified. But you guys are down here solidly in red. So you've got plenty of oak wilt down here. And I'm going to show a little video. We did some videos. We have a 3.5-minute video and then a little trailer that I won't show, but we did some videos about oak wilt, and these can be used if you're talking to a master gardener group or some other small group that might have some interest in basic oak wilt biology. So let me get this set up. Speaker there. Get out of this. All right. And go full screen.
I wasn't totally sure it was oak wilt. It was early to midsummer. The tree was just getting worse and worse. And then about in middle of September, it started just raining the leaves down. It ended up they were over 80 years old. And to be gone in 6 weeks, that's kind of hard to take.
Oak wilt as a fungal disease tends to focus on the water conducting system of the tree, and it kind of gums it up and makes it so that the tree can't move water anymore. And that's why it wilts rapidly and those leaves start to drop in July or August.
So oak wilt is a deadly pathogen of red oaks, and once a tree gets infected, it may die within 3 to 5 weeks. When an oak gets infected, that's a red oak, it will certainly die from oak wilt.
There are 2 ways that oak wilt can be spread, overland and underground. The first is overland, spread by beetles, which can spread it from tree to tree. Beetles will move the fungal spores on their bodies to a fresh wound, and if that fresh wound is on an oak tree, then that oak can get oak wilt. Once a tree becomes infected with oak wilt, then the fungus moves into the root system and it can spread to neighboring trees through root grafts. So what you don't see can kill your tree.
Right now we're in Sealy, Wisconsin at Roman Venture Base Camp, really in the heart of the Canva Trail System, which is an amazing 300 plus mile mountain bike, marked and mapped mountain bike trail system. We're a pretty mixed hardwood forest here, so that gives us some protection from oak wilt, but still it's a risk. Well, we're trying to prevent oak wilt by, first of all, not allowing firewood to be transported into our campground from outside the area. We provide wood for people. There's plenty to collect off the forest floor. Secondly, we make sure we don't do any kind of harvesting of oak. We try to make sure if we are harvesting anything else that we don't cause injury to an oak tree during that critical time when they're vulnerable.
After July 15th, the risk of overland oak wilt transmission drops significantly. So the safer time to prune your trees is in the fall.
Landowners have a variety of different options to stop the spread of oak wilt once it gets into a tree, and those typically revolve around creating either a physical barrier or a biological barrier to stop the spread. We want to encourage people to the extent possible to try to prevent oak wilt first from getting to their property, and if it gets there, work with their forest health specialist or DNR forester or consulting forester to find a viable solution that works for them within their cost constraints and within the constraints of their property to try to stop the spread of oak wilt.
If we can slow this down, and if I know that we've done everything in our power that we can do, I feel good about that.
So I should have probably started with this comment. I don't usually bring joy and happiness to my just saying.
Oak wilt is a serious tree disease, one of the most serious tree diseases in the eastern United States because of how rapidly it can kill trees. Trees in the red oak family, it can kill within 2.
All right. All right, there we go. Let me shut this off. All right, so that video that you just saw is available on the DNR's YouTube channel, so you can share it with your neighbors if you have some neighbors that maybe move into the area and are new to the oak wilt issue. That hopefully gives them some background. Hopefully you guys found that a little bit interesting as well. So oak wilt does spread in two ways. The overland transmission is spread by beetles in the spring of the year. That's the high-risk time period. The beetles are out, the fungus is fruiting and producing spores, and that creates that high-risk time period from April through July. Once a tree has oak wilt, it moves down into the root system, and red oak trees will graft to other nearby red oak trees pretty easily. And the fungus can then move through one root system and directly into another root system and start to kill that tree as well. In that way, it creates ever-expanding pockets of mortality. Now, we do have some oak wilt guidelines related to timber sales and harvesting of trees. They were recently reviewed in 2016, and the cutting restriction periods remained the same as they had been previously. April 1st to July 15th in the southern counties, that's these kind of brown colored counties, so Waupaca is included in that. And then April 15 to July 15 in the northern counties. And that difference in dates with the start date is because the beetles come out a little bit earlier down here. There are some exceptions and modifications for timber sales. So if you have property that has oak wilt on it and you're thinking of a timber sale, make sure and discuss the oak wilt restrictions and what your options are with your forester that you're working with. The urban forest restriction dates are a little more generic, just to make it easier to remember: April, May, June, and July. Do not prune, wound, or harvest your oak trees during that time period. And if you do prune, wound, or harvest your oak trees during that time period, paint the wounds immediately with a latex paint. That will prevent the beetles from getting to that wound. It'll prevent the beetles from introducing the fungus, and you'll have saved your trees from getting oak wilt themselves or from spreading into the root system and then moving to neighboring trees. Now, there is some research out of Minnesota that shows those dates in the spring are indeed the high-risk time period. This shows the months of the year down here. The number of contaminated beetles that are carrying oak wilt spores on their bodies, are over here. So you can see it builds up starting in April, builds up rapidly into May, and then drops off into July. So that truly is the high-risk time period when those beetles can be moving the fungus. And that's when you don't want to be pruning, wounding, or harvesting your trees, because those fresh wounds really attract these beetles. If you've already got oak wilt, which I saw by a show of hands, there's quite a few of you, there are some options for controlling it. They all have to address the root system. In order to stop oak wilt, you have to do something about the root system. Otherwise, it will keep spreading outwards in that root system. So root severing with a 5-foot-long vibratory plow used to be the standard tried and true method. It still is. It can just be really difficult to find a vibratory plow. That's going to go through your woods. Now we've got some extra options that are wonderful. A stump extraction option. So some people own a bulldozer or excavation equipment that they can rip those stumps right out of the ground. That disturbs the root system. Or there are 2 herbicide options where you either do a double frill girdle, which, where's my pointer there? This picture is showing a double frill girdle with a chainsaw. So you cut all the way around that tree about an inch deep, and then you spray it with an herbicide to kill this tree that is directly root grafted to the tree that died from oak wilt. In that way, you will kill the root system of this tree and prevent the fungus from being able to move out to the rest of the trees in your stand. So there are some options. Herbicide a lot of times is a little easier for landowners to handle. So those are really nice options that we have now. If you want some more information about this, I've got some documents that I can send you. I do have some cards over there with my email address on them. You're welcome to grab a card and drop me an email, and I can give you a lot more information about controlling oak wilt on your land if you're interested in that. We are working on an herbicide trial that's started in 2015, and it's located around the state in many different areas, many different counties. All of the black dots are stands where we have been working on these herbicide trials so that we can write a scientific paper that shows for absolute certainty that yes, these herbicide trials work. We have a lot of observational evidence that they work, but until now we have not done a full-blown scientific study, so this is pretty exciting for us. There's a lot more oak wilt information on our DNR webpage because oak wilt is a huge topic. This is the Forest Health, the DNR Forest Health webpage, and we have these categories down here. So there's a disease category, and there's a variety of diseases that you can click on for more information. Oak wilt is one of those. So you can click on that and get lots more information about oak wilt. Heterobasidian root disease is another fungal disease that attacks the roots, but this one operates primarily in our conifers. It is a major disease in red pine. We also see it in white pine. It is found down in this area. So if you have red pine or white pine or even jack pine, you can potentially get heterobasidian root disease, shortened to HRD. It used to be called anosum. Then the pathologist changed the fungal name, and we had to change the common name to something that's much more easy to say, right? So heterobasidian root disease is a white rot. It causes a white punky rot in the roots of the trees, and it eventually kills the trees. So if you learned about this at all in college, which you may not have, it's relatively new in Wisconsin. It was first found in 1993. It was previously, many years ago, called Phomizinosis, and then it was called Heterobasidian anosum, and now it's called Heterobasidian irregulare. I'm sure it'll change again in another 10 years, so I wouldn't bother learning these names. It does primarily affect pine, but once it's in a site, then we'll actually find it growing on some of our hardwoods. It doesn't necessarily kill our hardwoods, but it slows their growth substantially. So this is a pretty substantial disease to get onto your property. And once you have it, it can stay there for decades in the soil and impact any trees that grow on your site. The map on the left with the green counties, all those counties have at least one known location of HRD in them. The map on the right, all of the small blue dots are areas where we know HRD is actually present. And then the larger light blue circles surrounding those dots, that's a 25-mile radius, which will become important in just a second. So we do find this kind of scattered across the state. But in this area where we've got so much red pine and white pine, it's a little more concentrated, unfortunately. So the way that HRD works is when you go in and properly manage your stand by doing regular thinnings, the spores of the fungus will come and land on one of those fresh cut stumps that you created. They will then start to grow into that stump and start to decay the stump. They'll move down into the root system and start to decay the root system. And then if they are touching the root systems of other living trees, they can move over into those trees. And in that way, they create kind of a hopscotching motion from tree to tree to tree, and it does create an ever-expanding pocket of mortality, sort of similar to oak wilt. There are some treatment options for preventing new infections. And in order to do that, you have to treat the fresh cut stumps immediately with a fungicide. And this is a cutting bar of a processor head. And I think I zoom in here. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see this blue liquid squirting out of it. I mean, this isn't the way the cutting bar should be when it's cutting a tree, but this is for photo purposes. So you can see this blue liquid spraying out here. And that blue liquid is a product called Cellutreat. We also have a product called Rot Stop C, which when you treat stumps, fresh cut stumps with these products, even if the spores land on those stumps, it cannot grow into that stump. So you've prevented an infection from occurring. So it can be quite important to do preventative stump treatment in your pine stands. We're in the process right now of reviewing the current guidelines for HRD. Currently, the only place that it is absolutely required to do stump treatments on pine harvests is on state properties. State properties that have more than 50% pine present on the property at the time of harvest and are within 25 miles of a known HRD pocket. So that was that map with the light blue circles surrounding each of the known locations of HRD. So we want to protect those stands so that we don't get additional HRD in them, because once you have HRD, there is no way to actually eradicate it. We've tried to eradicate it with fire. We've tried to eradicate it by scraping all the topsoil off a site, and it remains. So It's a pretty tough fungus that way. All right, Japanese beetles. There is a document over there from UW Extension that talks a little bit about Japanese beetles. I'm guessing a lot of you might already have experience with Japanese beetles. Yeah. So they're a little more common down here in the central part of the state. The sandy parts of the state, they do great in. So this is the lovely beetle. Lovely. They do some beautiful skeletonizing of leaves. They're very, very effective at defoliation, unfortunately. They defoliate a huge number of different types of plants. One thing that I always mention in my presentations, which luckily most people know by now, but if you buy traps to trap Japanese beetles, the traps work wonderfully, but they will draw in beetles from all your neighbors. So if you want to put a trap out, don't put it next to the plant that you're trying to protect. Put it in the other corner of your property, because the traps work really well. You can use insecticides and repellents to keep them off your prize plants. There are some options for adult control, like those insecticides and repellents, but there are also some options for grub control, because the Japanese beetle larval stage is a white grub that lives under the soil. So again, there's an extension document over there with a lot more information if it's not something you're already familiar with. This is a problem that you guys had down in this area last summer. I kind of suspect you'll see it again this summer, unfortunately. So this is, I don't know if I have a close-up. Yep, I do. So this is jumping oak gall. It is a defoliator, but it's this tiny little speck that you see. It's a gall-forming insect. It forms this little tiny bump on the leaf. And there's an insect living inside that little tiny bump. It is sucking the juice from the leaves, and it causes this browning of the leaves. Unfortunately, there's nothing that can be sprayed to prevent it or to kill it once you notice it's in your tree. But by and large, our white oaks can handle a couple years of pretty significant defoliation, and they'll be fine. So we had significant defoliation last year. If we have another year of it this year, I still wouldn't be overly worried, but man, it can look pretty rough. You know, it looks like the leaves are kind of just dripping off the trees. They look awful. And so we did see this extensively across the county last year. So that's jumping oak gall. Gypsy moth. Gypsy moth has been around in this part of the state for quite a number of years. Some years we have bigger populations than others. I'm going to pass around a Riker mount showing all the different life cycle stages of gypsy moth. Once it gets all the way to the back, someone just make a pile back there. I'll pick it up, because I have more stuff I'm going to send around too. So gypsy moth is still a problem. It will forever be a problem. The caterpillar is the one that does the damage. It's a large, hairy caterpillar. It has pairs of blue dots and pairs of red dots, and it eats a wide variety of tree species, of the leaves of tree species. This map on the upper right, all of these red counties are the quarantine area for gypsy moth. So although gypsy moth is marching westward, it has not gotten all the way across the state yet. So we've had it here for quite a while. And I think a lot of people are just managing it as if it's one more defoliator now. But there are people out here on the western side of the state that are still panicking about gypsy moth because they don't have it yet. So something to keep in mind. The last big outbreak that we had was 2010, and there was one little spot right here in Waupaca County from 2010, but there was a large area up here in Marinette and Oconto counties, and we had a variety of other counties with hot spots. So that was 2010, major outbreak. Then in July of 2010, we got a few major rainfalls. And the gypsy moth caterpillars are very susceptible to a fungal disease called entomophaga. Entomophaga needs moisture in order to grow. So in that July, when we had all that rainfall, the entomophaga fungus all of a sudden exploded. We had massive die-off of the caterpillars, and we had people calling us and saying, "Thank you for spraying them." So, well, yeah, I'd like to take the credit, but I can't. Ever since then, the population has been quite low. Last year, we had a total of just 60 acres of defoliation. The population will probably stay low. We've got a variety of natural enemies that keep it in check, but every so often there is a chance that we'll have a very large outbreak again somewhere in the state. The map that you see on the left are the trap catch numbers. The hotter pink colors mean higher numbers. They don't trap back here anymore. They figure it's just everywhere. But as it marches westward across the state, they want to know where it's building up. So you can see there are some areas where it's still building up. There was a proposal recently, you probably heard about this in the news, to end the suppression spray program. Every media news article that I saw mixed up the suppression spray program with the slow the spread spray program. The suppression spray program is one that was organized by the Department of Natural Resources, and it was available to folks back here that had larger acreages and major problems with gypsy moth. You go out and you spray in the spring, you get some cost share money, and you could minimize the effects of defoliation on your trees. That proposal to end that suppression spray program went out for public comment. They've addressed those public comments, and now it's moving on from there. And it will probably end by the end of the year. It just wasn't utilized a whole lot. Up in the area up here, the advancing front line, this is where the Slow the Spread program, which is a program run by DATCAP, they do. There we go. They do treatments out in this area to try and keep this line of gypsy moth from advancing too rapidly. That program will continue, but the suppression spray program will probably be sunsetting very soon. And quite frankly, gypsy moth is just one more defoliator now. We have a lot of defoliators out there, and it will just be one more that we have. A couple of the others that are out at the same time as gypsy moth that people sometimes mistake for gypsy moth is our native eastern tent caterpillar and our native forest tent caterpillar. Back in 2010, when we had that big outbreak of gypsy moth down here in Waupaca County, we also had a small outbreak of forest tent caterpillar. So that was kind of interesting. They were both feeding in exactly the same spots. So you'd walk in there and you'd find both caterpillars, which, well, I guess I found it interesting. Probably other people didn't. Eastern tent caterpillar is the one that makes those web nests in the spring. And that one is one that tends to focus on cherry trees, like wild cherries along the roadside. So people will see those web nests often in the springtime, and they'll want to cut them out of the tree and burn them. I discourage that. If you have some of those web nests in your trees, I recommend that you get a bucket with some soapy water, you grab a rake, and you pull it out of the tree, and you just dump it in the bucket of soapy water, let it sit overnight. All the caterpillars will be dead. If you prune the branch out of the tree that web is on, you have done more damage to that tree than those caterpillars ever would. So don't do that. If you burn the caterpillars, the webs out of the trees, you're liable to start a wildfire. So don't do that. Very, very bad, especially this year. So forest tent caterpillar is one that does not make a web nest. This one does have periodic outbreaks, sort of like gypsy moth. The last outbreak that we had was 1999 to 2003, and that was a big outbreak across the northern part of the state. We're due for another outbreak. I'm not finding it anywhere, so I don't know. I keep looking for it. It should be around somewhere. At some point, we'll get another outbreak. But this is the caterpillar, forest tent caterpillar, kind of pretty with these blue stripes along the sides. But they tend to defoliate the same species as gypsy moth likes, which is aspen and oak. This one just happens to be native. All right, let's cover gypsy moth. I'm going to pass around a couple more things before I do that, though. So I'm going to pass around a Riker mount with some forest tent caterpillar adults, so you can see what those look like, as well as a caterpillar. I'm also going to pass around a Riker mount of oak tatters, which is a problem that you guys have down in this area. It is something that affects your oak trees. It makes the leaves look defoliated in the spring, but they're not defoliated by an insect. These leaves that have oak tatters are actually impacted by very minuscule amounts of pesticide. And it's not that someone has sprayed a pesticide and it has directly drifted onto those trees. A lot of times it's residual pesticide, perhaps from the year before, or it's pesticides that were sprayed and then they volatilize and they move somewhere. So it's very small amounts, but if it happens at the right time of year, the right time of leaf development, you can get that look on your oak leaves. And it looks like an insect defoliated them, but it didn't. Most of the time, the trees have no problem recovering from that. It just looks bad for a little while. All right, I'm going to start around a couple of things that are related to emerald ash borer as well. This is an emerald ash borer look-alike box. There's also a picture over there, a handout with some emerald ash borer look-alikes. Those are the green bugs. I also have an emerald ash borer look-alikes little brown bullet-shaped bugs. So I'll send that around as well. So emerald ash borer. How many of you have heard about emerald ash borer, done some research? Thank goodness. Oh, good. All right, so this is the last map that I have of where emerald ash borer is actually located. The counties where we've identified emerald ash borer are shaded in tan. The green areas of each county are the township or municipality where we've actually identified emerald ash borer. A Wisconsin statewide EAB quarantine just went into effect March 30th. So the entire state is now quarantined. It is no longer county by county. And this year there will be no trapping done for emerald ash borer. In the past you might have seen those big purple prism traps, triangular traps. Most of those were put up by USDA APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, and their budgets continue to get cut, and so trapping will be eliminated for Wisconsin this year. We do recommend that people be proactive regarding emerald ash borer. Don't wait for it to show up in your trees before you start doing something, or don't wait for it to show up in your forest stand before you start thinking about management. This is the beetle, and as it goes around, you'll see some examples of it. This is the beetle here. It is a wonderful green color, but they are very small. They're beautiful, but you're never going to see them, except here in this little vial. And then I'm going to also pass around a larvae, which the larvae are the ones that live under the bark. They feed in the cambium layer. They create these S-shaped tunnels going back and forth, and they're the ones that actually kill the tree. They're also not very big, so I'll send those around so you guys can see them. One thing that you can look for right now, even though there's no leaves on the trees, so you can't see if they're a good healthy crown of leaves or maybe some sparse leaves, one thing that you can look for right now is woodpecker damage on the trees. This is flecking, so it's not big, deep holes. That's not the type of woodpecker damage I'm talking about. This is the type of woodpecker damage where they're removing the outer layers of bark so that they can more easily jam their beaks in and pluck out a nice fat larvae. They do some really good work stripping this bark off, and it looks real pale, and that'll stand out at this time of year. So if you see this on an ash tree, walk up and take a closer look, and it may very well be emerald ash borer. I wanted to show you some impacts of emerald ash borer. I know it's new here, and so if you're not someone who travels in the southeastern part of the state, or if you haven't traveled in Ohio, or if you haven't traveled in the lower peninsula of Michigan, you may not have seen the impacts of emerald ash borer, so I wanted to show you some pictures from Wisconsin. So this is in 2012. This is Bigfoot Beach down in southeastern Wisconsin. Most of these trees here along the beachfront are ash trees. 2012, if you remember, was that dry, droughty year. The further south you went, the worse the drought got. 1 year later, they had to close the park for a while so that they could remove the ash trees along the beach, because the ash trees apparently were already fully infested, and then we had that severe drought and the trees just died very, very quickly. So they had to remove all of those trees. You can also see in the forest, there's some trees that are starting to die out in the woods. So that was 2013. Here's 2 years later. Here's the beach, a little different angle, I know, but here's the beach. And if you look out into the woods, there's trees that are dying from emerald ash borer. Here's the I-94 interchange at the Racine-Milwaukee County line. This is 2013, and there's already mortality showing up in this picture. You can see some dead trees here, maybe a few over here. If we go 3 years later, Lots of dead trees here, lots of dead trees here. If you look off in the distance now, there's dead trees showing up back there. Here's an example of emerald ash borer will go wherever the ash is. So in this situation, this is green ash that's growing all along this riverway, and that's where it found the ash to kill it. Here's a stand with a moderate component of ash. This was taken in 2016 down in Waupaca County, so emerald ash borer was present. Most of the ash in this stand are dead, so that's a moderate component of ash. So if this is your situation in your forest stand, this might be what your forest will look like eventually. I'm thinking maybe 10 years. Here's a moderate to high component of ash. And here's a stand that is almost completely ash and is almost completely killed. The understory that you're seeing here in green is buckthorn. Delightful, yes, I know. Emerald ash borer will go wherever the ash is. It's a good flyer. It can easily fly a half mile. It can certainly fly up to 3 miles. Gravid females, so pregnant females, can fly 5 miles. So I'm going to pass around a couple more samples. One is a bark sample, and there's some little red areas that are circled. Those are the D-shaped exit holes. And then I'll pass this one around, which shows the galleries that the larvae create underneath the bark. So emerald ash borer will go wherever the ash is. I get people constantly asking, well, there's not much ash around me, but I've got one in my front yard. Is it going to be missed? No. The emerald ash borer management recommendations are currently being reviewed. The focus is going to change from detection and salvage to management. So up until now, we've been trying to detect emerald ash borers so that people could start to prepare for emerald ash borers' eventual approach to their property. Now we're just going to say it's going to get to you, probably sooner than later, unfortunately. So we want to talk about management. It'll talk about maintaining stand productivity, not just the ash in your stand, but increasing some of the other species that you've got. There is some silviculture information for lowland ash stands. They can also be used for upland stands to get you thinking, what are your management options? Greg Edge recently did a breakout session on management, so he's got some new documentation that he could share. He's one of our silviculturists who has been working with some of our other silviculturists on emerald ash borer silviculture for our ash stands. And then, like I said, the silviculture guide is currently being reviewed. Whoops, I meant to delete that part, sorry about that. One thing that we are ramping up with, as far as emerald ash borer goes, is our parasitic wasp releases. These are a biocontrol agent. They are absolutely minuscule, but they are specific to emerald ash borer. They attack only emerald ash borer, and they're relatively good at attacking emerald ash borer. This will be a long-term management tool. This will not eliminate emerald ash borer. The map that you see in the lower right-hand corner, all of the red areas are areas where we have done releases so far, and these are releases that have been fully tested by USDA APHIS before we were ever allowed to do any releases. They will not impact any other species that we have. This is the egg parasitoid. You can see it's absolutely tiny. This is an emerald ash borer egg, which is 1 millimeter in size. So this little guy or this little gal is much smaller than that. But if they'll infest the emerald ash borer eggs, then the emerald ash borer is not going to emerge from that egg. This is a larval parasitoid. This is Tetrasticus planopenisi. It's also not very large, but this is what it looks like when it infests a larvae. So all of these ropey, lumpy, bumpy things you see in here are the larvae of Tetrasticus. So this emerald ash borer larvae is a goner, and many adult Tetrasticus are eventually going to emerge from that to attack more emerald ash borer larvae, which is pretty awesome. And then we have one more, Spathius galine, which is this critter down here, which in this picture makes it look monstrous and really nasty and dangerous. Yeah, no, they're about 3 millimeters in size. They're very, very small. They're stingless. All of these wasps are stingless, but they're called parasitic wasps. And this is the head capsule of an emerald ash borer larvae. The body goes back here, except there's not much of a body left anymore. All of these little cigar-shaped things are the larvae of Spathius. So these guys are doing good work for us. Unfortunately, these insects will not save the trees that you see today. These are going to be a long-term management tool. They will slow the spread of emerald ash borer. They might keep your trees alive a little bit longer to give you some additional time for management, but they are not going to save the trees that you have, that you're looking at today. There is some work on lingering ash in Michigan and Ohio, but so far we have not found any true genetic resistance to emerald ash borer in our trees, but we're still looking. So what can you do in your woodlots? Have a plan, contact a forester. There's a lot of great information out there now to be proactive in managing your forests. If you're not proactive and emerald ash borer shows up on your property, all of your ash will eventually die. Well, they're going to die anyway, even if you are proactive, but your stand has a better chance of looking like a nice forest if you're proactive. Like I said, the silviculture guide is currently being reviewed, so talk to a forester and focus on getting non-ash species established now. What about your yard trees? Because most people have an ash in their yard, or they know someone that does. There's a couple documents over on the table that are from UW Extension that talk about treating your ash tree and talk about whether your ash tree is even worth treating. The treatments work. They will save your ash tree. You have to treat for every year that you want to keep the tree alive, but they work. They're wonderful. My mom lives in the lower peninsula of Michigan, where they've had emerald ash borer for many years, for more than a decade, and her ash trees look beautiful in her yard. She treats them every year. If you don't want to treat, plan for removal. When emerald ash borer kills an ash tree, that ash tree becomes very brittle and very dangerous for someone working on that tree to remove it. So try and remove those trees before they're completely dead if you're not planning on treating those trees. And then get other species started now. With that, there's my email address, or like I said, I've got some cards over on the other side. And I know I covered a lot of things, but I also know I didn't cover a lot of things. My job is fabulous. There are so many different insect and diseases to talk about. So, are there any questions?
Is there any difference between the oak trees?
Between
like white and red?
Yeah, between the oak trees for oak wilt?
Right.
Yes. So the red oak trees will be very completely killed within 6 weeks. They will go from looking alive to be completely dead. And those are trees in the red oak group. So your northern red oak, northern pin oak, and black oak. The white oaks are sort of resistant to it. Bur oak is in between. If bur oak is stressed, oak wilt can kill it. If bur oak is healthy, it might be able to fend it off. So yeah, there is some differences. Absolutely. Question up here?
Yeah, I have a question and a comment first.
Mm-hmm.
Those who don't know the difference between a red oak and a white oak, the red oaks have the very pointy, the lobes on the leaves are really pointy.
Mm-hmm.
And the white oaks have rounded lobes on the leaves, so it's easy to tell. My question is about how long the organisms stay in the soil after the oak wilt has passed through an area and taken down all the red oaks.
Yeah.
The squirrels have been busy planting acorns, of course.
Good.
And so there are little red oaks coming back up.
Perfect.
But
They're fine.
they potentially will live, and
They'll have to get their own fungal disease. They'll have to get their own oak wilt. Because the trees that died, the oak wilt fungus will remain in the root system for 7 years, but it's stuck in that root system. So the small little seedlings that you've got coming up are not going to root graft to that other big root system for many years. And by then, that fungus will be dead. So yes, you can start growing red oaks, little oak seedlings, right in the middle of an oak wilt pocket, and they'll be fine.
so this isn't going to permanently take away the red oaks in the United States.
Correct. This will not eliminate oak from your property. Yes, that's a great question, a great point. Yeah, question here.
I have a purple autumn ash, 2 of them. Are these just as susceptible?
Yeah, so he's asking about the autumn purple ash, which is a cultivar of white ash. And white ash, green ash, black ash, they're all equally susceptible. So if you would like to save those, you can certainly treat them. You can buy the chemicals at any place that sells pesticides and treat it yourself. You mix it up in a bucket, you pour it around the base of your tree, and it protects it for 1 year. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Oh. When the people come and trim trees, they go up pretty high up in the tree. Does that damage the tree at all?
So the question is about people trimming trees and how high they go in the tree. It depends how they're moving in the tree. If they're moving with a rope and saddle, that does not damage the trees at all, really, regardless of how high they go up, as long as they're not breaking branches. And they can go up quite a ways and not break branches. If they're climbing that tree using spikes, that does put a small wound into the tree. And so anyone climbing a wound or climbing a tree with tree spikes should not do that in the spring of the year when oak wilt is a high risk period, because they can then put wounds in those trees and allow oak wilt to get in. But as far as rope and saddle work, no, they can go up quite a ways and they're fine.
What I was really referring to is it destructive to the tree to have it trimmed up high? People do that so that they get more sunlight into the lawn.
So there's a couple different things related to tree pruning that are good and bad. So you've probably all seen those trees where people just top them. They take off, they round them up, they prune off all the small branches, and don't do that. That is awful for the trees. People think that they're cutting it back, making it more safe. You're actually creating a hazard, because all of the epicormic sprouts that are going to come up off those branches that you just pruned off are not going to be firmly attached to those branches. And so by the time they get to be a larger branch, they're just going to start breaking off. So that can be very bad. But there are proper pruning techniques that can take off up to 1/4 of the entire crown of the tree, which do actually promote growth. So there are good and bad ways of pruning. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question without maybe seeing some pictures of exactly what situation you're dealing with, but there's good and bad for pruning. So back here? Oh, over here somewhere?
Do you have something?
Nope. Okay.
Okay. The moratorium, or whatever you want to call it, the times when you shouldn't be harvesting the oak.
Yep.
If a tree's been dead, can you take it out in that time frame?
So if you have a tree, any tree species that's dead, or an oak tree that's dead, and it's during that spring high-risk time period of the year, can you remove that tree? You can remove that tree. It's not going to increase the amount of oak wilt in the area unless, when you're dropping that tree, you're damaging branches in the crown of other oaks. So if you've got a dead tree and you're like, it'll be fine, I can drop that one, but you damage branches in the nearby oak tree, then you've opened up that oak to get oak wilt. So you can take them down, but if you damage other oaks, that's a risk. Yeah.
We got a question.
Yep.
Two quick questions. If a pine tree got wiped out last year, the top half broke off. It's not good. Remove it.
Is it white pine or red pine? Do you know? No idea. Okay.
Big pine needles.
Long ones, stiff?
Yeah.
Stiff or soft?
They're long.
Okay, so it's either white pine or red pine probably. White pine has real soft, wispy needles. Red pine has stiffer needles. If it took the top out of a red pine, it's just going to become a red pine shrub. That's probably all the more it's going to grow. Red pine does not recover from cutting the tops off very well. White pine does, but red pine, it's not going to kill the tree. It'll just stop growing upwards.
And all the water that goes in the broken.
It can cause some staining, it can cause some decay, but it'll be pretty slow, a slow process.
The other question, there was that big windstorm we had last July, and then utility companies came through and just leveled a whole bunch of trees. Do they have to follow that same quarantine criteria?
The larger utility companies are required to follow the oak wilt guidelines. Our smaller cooperatives are not, but we have done some outreach programs to try and educate those smaller cooperatives to make sure that they realize waiting until after July 15th is ideal. And if they need to be pruning oaks prior to that, paint the wounds. Not all of them do it, but we've had an outreach campaign to try and make them aware. So, yeah. Next question in the back?
Yes.
Okay.
I still remember all the nursery stories that I used to read with the wonderful little ladybugs. What the blankety blank happened?
Yeah, so the ladybugs. So the ladybugs that get in your house are an exotic species of ladybug. They were introduced in the early 70s down in Louisiana to control pecan aphids, and they've just been expanding their range ever since. They like to overwinter in caves or your house or your garage. I strongly recommend that people spray the outside of their house in the fall of the year to repel them from your house. If you can keep them out in the fall of the year, you won't have problems during the winter. You won't have problems right now. I recently bought a house this past fall. The guy did not spray. So there's a lot of ladybugs coming out. Have been all winter. And if you spray the outside of your house in the fall, it's usually about the first week of October, second week of October, after we've had a good hard frost, and then it warms up a little, we get those nice sunny days. That's what triggers the ladybugs. I gotta find a place to overwinter. So if your house is protected at that point, it will repel them and they just won't come to your house. And then you're good for winter and spring.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about landscaping with trees and planting depths. I've heard that it's especially vital with maples that you plant at the right depth and everything.
Yeah.
So I drive around town and I'm really concerned about people who are landscaping and, you know, putting dirt up like a foot above the ground on that and building up with bricks and stuff. Is that a problem with trees?
It is, yeah, absolutely. So trees have a root collar where above that is stem material and below that is roots. If you put soil up against the stem area of the tree, you can increase decay in that area of the tree because it's not supposed to be moist all the time. It's not supposed to be underground. So it is best to find that root collar, plant that at ground level, and all the roots will go down. They're not going to be planted a foot or 2 feet down. I realize that. They'll grow that way eventually. But you also mentioned maples. One problem we have with maples, Norway maples especially, is girdling roots. People buy a maple, the roots have maybe started to circle around the pot a little bit, but maybe they don't look that bad. You've got to straighten those roots out with Norway maple because those roots will not straighten out on their own. And so if you buy a pot that's this big, this is how big your tree is going to get and then it's going to die. Or if you buy a pot that's this big with your tree in it, that's how big your tree is going to get before it dies. Because all of those roots are just going to grow, and as the tree grows, it will eventually grow into those roots and it'll girdle itself. So it's really important to spread out those roots, rip that root ball apart. The tree will recover. Just go to town on it. So yeah, planting is important, and I know that it's a constant fight for our urban foresters to reinforce that message that you don't have to plant the trees a foot deep. So yeah, that's a good topic.
Question about a good-sized soft maple shade tree I have that is, for the past 3 years or so, been royally attacked by those lovely downy woodpeckers.
Oh.
2 branches, good medium size, about 2/3 of the way up, are dying. Do those need to be pruned after fall, and does latex work on a soft maple?
So the question is about a soft maple that has woodpecker damage. So the woodpecker damage that you're talking about, is it removing the bark or is it putting little rows of holes in it?
Holes, but it's losing some bark too.
It's losing some bark, okay. Because we have 2 different things that I'll see attacking trees from our woodpecker species. So the downy and the hairy woodpeckers will remove the outer layers of the bark if there are insects either in the bark overwintering or just under the bark. And if they get really overzealous with that, they will girdle the tree. They'll girdle the branch at that point. They can remove the bark right down to the cambium layer, and it will die from that point out. And then you would want to prune that off. We also, though, have sapsuckers, which will create little rows of holes on your trees, and the trees will usually grow over those wounds and continue to survive. So depends what you've got, but if they get to the point where they're killing that outer tip of the branch, you'll want to prune that off. Until that point, I wouldn't worry about it, actually. Yeah, they can stay.
I've changed my idea about tent caterpillars because Doug Talmy says that they give all of our songbirds who are trying to raise young in the spring, it gives them a lot of caterpillars to eat. And so unless it's in one of my apple trees, I just leave them alone now.
Good.
And so just a hint there.
Yes.
Sometimes it's easier to use a spray can of paint for those oak wounds. And it's hard to find water-based spray paint.
True.
Yeah, is it really bad to have used the other kind?
If it's on a stump, no. But the oil-based paints can be slightly phytotoxic. So if you've got a wound, let's say you pruned off a branch and you paint it with an oil-based paint, that may kill a slightly larger area of the tree, and it'll just take the tree longer to heal over that, to grow over that. So that's why we say latex, because the oil-based can be a little bit phytotoxic sometimes. Okay, yeah.
My question is about an eagle nest that I have in a large white pine, I believe, in northwestern Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
Will that kill the crown of the tree eventually?
It can. I have seen that happen. Because they keep adding to the nest every year, those nests can get very, very heavy, and they can at times start to block the growth of some of the branches. So it can sometimes cause top mortality. It takes a long time, though.
Okay.
Well,
and we've seen woodpeckers already on that tree, so I don't know if it already has an issue. It's very close to the water, and the water has been very high the last few years. A lot of trees near the water are dying.
Yeah. We're seeing that on a lot of our lakes and streams, and you're right, the water level has come up on those, which is fabulous because for like 15 years we had relatively low water levels, and now the water levels have come back up, but it is affecting some of our trees, so yeah.
Question?
I don't want to run you guys too late. Someone monitor my time too.
We're doing fine.
We're okay? Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
What is your definition of a forest? I think of it as something kind of big and vast and going on for miles, but it seems like there's some smaller plots. Is there a certain acreage or square footage that defines forest?
There is not. The way that you manage forest often depends on the amount of trees that you have, so the number of trees, the size of the trees, the species of the trees. So you can have an urban forest where you have very few trees per acre, but it's still a canopy cover. It still functions as a forest is supposed to function. And so you can have that situation, or you can have a very dense, pure, natural stand of, say, hardwoods that grew up naturally. And there's no houses or roads through them. They haven't been thinned, or maybe they have been thinned by a good forester. But there are many different types of forests as far as the definition of forest.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question if there's another one. Otherwise, here we have one.
I see one here.
Going for it.
Yeah, yep.
Has the DNR changed the definition of a reforestation cut versus a thinning cut?
Oh, I see. So there are a lot of different types of harvests. Some of them are thinnings, which are intermediate cuts as the stand continues to advance in age, and others of them are designed to promote regeneration. So there are different situations where you may create a gap, which will promote regeneration, but much of the rest of the forest will still be a dense forest. There are other situations where you might have an even space, relatively even spacing of mature, what are called crop trees, which would produce seed and reforest that area. So they'd be well spaced out with plenty of light for seedlings coming up. But so a thinning and something that's going to do a regeneration cut, they can be quite different. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much,
All right,
Linda.
thank you.